In a small town, dozens of dogs were found locked in a dark basement. When the veterinarian arrived at the scene, she discovered something that defied all logic. The animals demonstrated extraordinary intelligence. A story of cruelty transformed into a scientific miracle that shocked the world. The secret behind these dogs will forever change our understanding of the limits of animal life. Prepare to be moved. Like, subscribe, and comment on where you're watching this incredible journey from. In the small town of Willow Creek, where time seemed to move slower and traditions remained as vibrant as bonfire flames in July, Sundays followed an almost sacred rhythm. Dawn brought the sound of the town church bells echoing through the valleys, calling the faithful to the 8 o'clock mass. Families walked along the brick streets, greeting neighbors, sharing smiles and brief stories before taking their usual places on the wooden pews, polished by generations of prayers. On that particular Sunday, the sky boasted an almost unreal blue, cloudless, as if wanting to frame the peace that reigned in the town. Father Michael had just finished his sermon on compassion and love for one's neighbor when the first murmurs began to circulate through the church. Initially discreet, they soon turned into a growing buzz that not even respect for the sacred place could contain. A disturbing discovery had just shaken the foundations of quiet Willow Creek. The old mansion of the Mendonca family, abandoned for nearly 2 decades on the outskirts of the rural area, held a dark secret in its stone and time-worn wooden bowels. The place that many believed to be completely empty, except for ghosts of a forgotten past, harbored a shocking reality. 50 dogs imprisoned in a windowless basement, deprived of sunlight and confined in conditions that defied any notion of humanity. The news arrived in a frantic phone call to the local police station. Frank, a farmer who rarely participated in the town's social events, had heard desperate barks coming from the mansion during the previous night's storm. The torrential rain had created a small landslide in the land adjacent to the structure, revealing a small opening to the underground area that was previously completely hidden by dense vegetation and accumulated debris. The critters seemed to have been down there for a long time, were his exact words, spoken in a trembling voice on the phone. Something very wrong is happening there. Sheriff Robert, a practical and sensible man who had held the position for over 30 years, knew exactly who to call even before organizing a team to verify the report. He dialed the number of Dr. Helen Miller, the veterinarian who had arrived in town just 6 months before, bringing with her not only her diplomas and specializations, but a reputation as a fervent defender of animal rights. Helen answered on the first ring, as if her body already knew, even before her mind, that this call would change the course of her life. She was finishing breakfast on the small porch of her inherited country house from her maternal grandmother. A simple but cozy place, with a view of hills covered by lush vegetation. She didn't even need to hear all the details. In 15 minutes, she was already with her pickup truck parked in front of the police station, loaded with emergency equipment, transport crates, and medications. The group that followed to the mansion included the sheriff, 2 police officers, Helen, and 3 volunteers from the makeshift animal protection group she had organized since her arrival. The dirt road leading to the property was partially blocked by branches fallen during the storm, making the approach slower and tenser. The silence in the vehicle was broken only by the sound of tires crushing twigs and the occasional nervous sigh of some occupant. The mansion emerged imposing in the landscape, like a dark scar in the midst of the vibrant green of the spring vegetation. With its windows sealed by boards nailed in a misaligned way, and the peeling facade revealing old bricks, the place seemed to emanate an aura of abandonment and mystery. But what really caught Helen's attention was the sound, a sad and rhythmic chorus of barks coming from the bowels of the earth, almost like a coordinated song of collective despair. "My God," she whispered, feeling a chill run down her spine. Her intuition, the same one that had so often guided her in critical rescue situations, screamed that what they would find there would be like nothing they had ever seen before. The entrance to the basement was located through the opening that the rain had revealed. Widening the access with tools brought by the police officers, they were soon able to descend a damp and slippery stone staircase. The smell was the first sensation that hit them, a suffocating mixture of humidity, excrement, rotten food, and an indefinable, almost metallic odor that Helen could not identify. But that made her stomach turn. When the flashlights cut through the almost complete darkness of the underground environment, the scene revealed elicited exclamations of horror and disbelief. In a space of approximately 2,000 square feet, divided by improvised walls with rusty metal screens, were the 50 dogs. Thin, with matted and dull fur, lying on a filthy floor, they represented a living testimony to human cruelty. However, what left Helen truly perplexed was not the physical condition of the animals, as terrible as it was, but their behavior. There was none of the expected reaction from mistreated animals. There was no aggression, desperate barking, or attempts to escape when humans approached. Instead, the dogs silently organized themselves into formation, as if following an invisible protocol established long before. The larger and apparently stronger ones positioned themselves at the front as protectors. Others gathered around the puppies and the most debilitated. And even more surprising, some carried in their mouths small bowls improvised from old cans, offering water to companions who seemed unable to move. It was a demonstration of social organization that defied any conventional explanation. "They are taking care of each other," murmured one of the volunteers, his voice choked with emotion and disbelief. Helen approached slowly, crouching a few feet from the first group of dogs. Her years of experience with traumatized animals had taught her never to make sudden movements, to wait for non-verbal permission before invading the animal's space. A black Labrador, with visible scars on his snout and a white star-shaped mark on his chest, stepped forward. His amber eyes met Helen's with a disturbing intensity. "It's okay now," she whispered, extending her hand with her palm up in a universal gesture of peace. "We've come to help." The Labrador tilted his head slightly, as if assessing not only the words but the truth behind them. Then, to the astonishment of everyone present, he turned to the other dogs and issued a series of short, patterned barks. Immediately, the group relaxed their defensive posture, some even timidly wagging their tails. "Did he understand what you said?" asked Sheriff Robert, unable to hide the astonishment in his voice. Helen did not answer. A strange sensation took over her, a mixture of wonder and unease. In her 15 years dedicated to veterinary medicine and animal rescue, she had never witnessed similar behavior. This was not just instinct or conditioning, it was something deeper, more complex. The rescue proceeded methodically, with the volunteers transporting the dogs to the surface, where preliminary health assessments were carried out. Surprisingly, despite the deplorable conditions of captivity, most presented only superficial problems: moderate malnutrition, parasite infestations, some poorly healed wounds. No critical cases that justified immediate emergency care. It was during this process that the sheriff and one of the officers found the person responsible for that situation. An elderly man, thin to the point of fragility, with disheveled white hair and a beard that seemed to have not been cared for in months, was lying in a small antechamber adjacent to the main basement. The place had a simple bed, shelves crammed with books and notebooks, and walls covered with annotations and diagrams incomprehensible at first glance. "I didn't hurt them," were his first words when confronted, spoken in a calm, almost didactic tone. "I protected them, you don't understand." The man offered no resistance and identified himself as Ernest Vance, 78 years old, a former researcher in the scientific field, although he did not specify which science he practiced. As he was led out of the property, Helen noticed that several of the dogs looked in his direction, not with fear or anger, as would be natural in abused animals in the presence of their aggressor, but with a kind of silent recognition. Among Ernest's belongings, dozens of notebooks filled with meticulous annotations were found. Each animal had its own file, with the date of admission, observed behaviors, feeding patterns, and, more peculiarly, something he called cognitive development and emerging capabilities. There were also quite old official documents, with government stamps partially faded by time, mentioning a Project Sentinel, and technical terms such as neurological potentiation and behavioral bioengineering. With the municipal facilities completely unprepared to receive 50 dogs at once, Helen made an impulsive decision that would irrevocably change the course of her life. She would transform her own country house into a temporary sanctuary for the rescued animals. Her property was not large, just 3 acres with a modest main house and some outbuildings, but it had enough outdoor space, running water, and, most importantly, adequate distance from neighbors so that the barking would not cause immediate problems. That night was the first of many sleepless ones for Helen. After organizing makeshift accommodations for the dogs with the help of the volunteers, she retreated to the porch with a cup of tea and Ernest's notebooks. Hours passed as she delved into those annotations, feeling increasingly disturbed by what she discovered. The man had kept almost daily records for nearly 20 years, detailing observations about the dogs that seemed to belong more to the realm of science fiction than reality. Subject the Marsh 17 demonstrated today the ability to predict the MON 23's seizure 30 minutes in advance, through specific agitated behavior and patterned barks, said one of the entries. Confirmation that interspecies communication is evolving as designed. The implants are working beyond initial expectations. Another annotation, dated approximately 5 years earlier, was even more disturbing. The group is developing its own communication system, independent of the parameters originally established. I observe patterns of knowledge transmission between generations that should not be possible without direct human intervention. The collective neural network seems to be gaining autonomous complexity. Helen felt a shiver run down her spine as she read those words. What exactly had been done to those animals? Who was Ernest Vance really? And more importantly, what did all this mean for the future of those 50 dogs that were now under her responsibility? Sleep finally overcame her in the early hours, but it was a restless rest, populated by fragmented dreams of dogs that spoke with human eyes and underground laboratories hidden in dark forests. She woke up with the first ray of sunlight and the soft sound of coordinated barks coming from the yard. Not chaotic or strident, but almost melodious, like a morning conversation between old friends. The first weeks with the dogs were a period of fascinating and disturbing discoveries. Helen established a rigorous observation system, ironically inspired by Ernest's own methods, documenting behaviors and interactions. What she found defied all logic and conventional veterinary knowledge. The dogs not only demonstrated extraordinary intelligence, learning complex commands with unusual ease, but exhibited capabilities that bordered on the supernatural. During an especially strong thunderstorm, 2 days after the rescue, they all grouped together in a precise formation in the safest corner of the property, minutes before lightning struck a tree on the other side of the property. When one of the volunteers, Matthew, had a sudden allergic reaction, 3 specific dogs began to circle around him, barking insistently, about 10 minutes before the first symptoms appeared. Even more remarkable was the clearly established hierarchy among them. The Labrador, with the white mark on his chest, whom Helen began to call Star, seemed to occupy a leadership position, with 5 other dogs forming a kind of council around him. Decisions about food distribution, rest areas, and even play seemed to go through this central group, before being implemented by the others. Helen kept these observations secret, sharing only generalities with the volunteers and authorities. Something told her that revealing the true nature of those animals could put them at risk. The small town was already buzzing with rumors, from conspiracy theories about government experiments to supernatural explanations involving spiritual possessions. The reality, as Helen was beginning to suspect, could be even more extraordinary than any speculation. Meanwhile, Ernest Vance awaited trial in the local jail, remaining strangely serene and cooperative. He refused, however, to provide detailed explanations about the dogs, limiting himself to repeating, "I saved them. One day you will understand it was necessary." A month after the rescue, during the traditional town fair of Willow Creek, the first public incident occurred that would reveal the exceptionality of the dogs to the community. Helen had brought 10 of the most sociable animals for a training demonstration as part of a responsible adoption awareness campaign. The central square overflowed with residents and visitors, immersed in the typical atmosphere of religious and cultural celebration of rural America. No one noticed when little Luke, just 4 years old, stealthily wandered away from his parents while they were buying treats at a stall. The child, fascinated by a colorful balloon that had escaped from another child, followed it to the edge of the creek that cut across the edge of the square. The current, normally gentle, was strengthened by recent rains. A slip on the muddy bank was all it took for the imminent tragedy. It was Honey, a medium-sized caramel-colored mixed-breed dog, one of the shyest dogs in the rescued group, who detected the danger. Her behavior suddenly changed during the demonstration, interrupting the presentation with sharp, insistent barks. Before Helen could react, Honey broke the leash that held her and darted towards the creek, immediately followed by Star and 2 other dogs, as if a silent command had been given. The alarmed shouts of the crowd turned into exclamations of astonishment when they saw what was happening. Honey had plunged into the water without hesitation, swimming with surprising strength for an animal that, as far as everyone knew, had never even seen a body of water larger than a basin. Star, in turn, ran along the bank, barking in precise rhythmic patterns that seemed to guide the operation. When Honey reached the boy, who had already been dragged almost 50 yards by the current, she gently grabbed him by his shirt and began the return. The third dog, a German shepherd that Helen called Guardian, positioned himself strategically at a point where the bank was less steep, facilitating the exit from the water. The rescue was executed with almost military precision, as if it had been rehearsed countless times. Luke was returned to his frightened but unharmed parents, except for a few superficial scratches and the understandable shock. The crowd, who had watched everything in a surreal silence, erupted in applause and exclamations when the boy was finally placed in safety. At that moment, the perception of the basement dogs, as they had been called by the residents, began to change drastically. News of the heroic rescue spread rapidly beyond the boundaries of Willow Creek. 3 days later, a news crew from the regional station appeared at Helen's country house, eager for a story about the savior dogs. And with them, a figure that made Helen's heart freeze momentarily. Dr. Michael Davies, professor at the Department of Animal Behavior at the State University, introducing himself as an expert interested in evaluating the dogs for possible academic research. Michael was not a stranger. 12 years earlier, during her doctorate, Helen had worked in his lab as a research assistant. The professional relationship had evolved into something more personal, intense and tumultuous, like many youthful passions. The breakup came after an irreconcilable disagreement over research methods. Helen could not approve of invasive procedures on animals, even with solid scientific justifications. The painful separation was one of the factors that propelled her to abandon her academic career and dedicate herself exclusively to clinical veterinary medicine and animal rights activism. "Helen," he greeted with a restrained smile, extending his hand. "Time has been kind to you." "I can't say the same about your research techniques," she replied automatically, without accepting the greeting. "Still cracking monkey skulls to satisfy your academic curiosity?" The reporters exchanged glances, clearly picking up on the unexpected. Michael maintained his composure, although a shadow crossed his face. "We've all evolved, haven't we? My department is now a reference in non-invasive methods of behavioral study." The reunion reopened wounds that Helen believed had healed years ago. Even more disturbing was Michael's specific interest in the dogs, especially after she reluctantly allowed him to observe the group for a few hours. His trained eyes, she realized, noticed much more than the reporters or volunteers. The unusual coordination, the communication patterns, the established hierarchy. When he requested permission to return with non-invasive monitoring equipment, Helen felt torn between personal distrust and the need to better understand the animals under her care. "I'll be back in 3 days," Michael said as he left, leaving a card with his number. "What you have here, Helen, could completely change our understanding of animal cognition. It's worth more than any resentment from the past." While public attention grew and Michael's presence added a layer of personal complication to the situation, investigations into Ernest Vance began to reveal even more surprising details. Documents recovered from a storage unit rented in his name included partial copies of classified government reports, dated from the early 2000s, describing Project Sentinel, a secret military initiative to develop animals with enhanced sensory capabilities. According to the documents, the program used experimental microchips implanted in the central nervous system of dogs selected for their intelligence and specific temperament. The devices functioned as neural amplifiers, drastically improving the animal's ability to detect chemical changes in the environment, predict low-intensity seismic events, and, perhaps more importantly, communicate with each other through a standardized system of vocalizations and body movements. The most shocking, however, was the discovery that Ernest was not a disturbed kidnapper, but one of the lead scientists of the original project. When the program was abruptly terminated due to budget cuts in 2005, the official order determined the humane deactivation of all experimental subjects, a euphemism for euthanasia. Ernest, unable to accept the fate of the animals he himself had helped to modify, disappeared with 50 of the dogs, using false identities and moving from town to town for years until finally settling in Willow Creek. The maintenance of the animals in the windowless basement was not the result of deliberate cruelty, as initially thought, but a consequence of Ernest's growing paranoia and a misguided interpretation of the implant's requirements. He mistakenly believed that prolonged exposure to sunlight could interfere with the functioning of the microchips, or worse, facilitate their detection by hostile agents he imagined were permanently on his trail. When Helen confronted Ernest with these discoveries during a visit to the local jail, the elderly man finally abandoned his evasive posture. With tears in his tired eyes and trembling hands, he explained, "I started wanting to save them, but I ended up imprisoning them as much as the project had done. The irony is not lost on me, Doctor." His voice carried the weight of decades of isolation and guilt. "But you need to understand, they are not just dogs with chips. What we created evolved. The original devices were designed to amplify existing capabilities, create basic communication patterns, never to develop collective consciousness or intergenerational transmission of knowledge." "What exactly are you saying?" asked Helen, trying to process the implications of those words. "I'm saying that the implants developed autonomously, using the organic material around them as a means of growth. They became a kind of neural network distributed among all the animals. Each new litter was born already connected, without the need for surgical intervention." He paused, searching for the right words. "What we have now is something entirely new, not completely canine, nor completely technological, a new form of emergent intelligence." The revelations about the dogs and their origin profoundly altered the dynamics in the small town. Willow Creek, which lived mainly on religious tourism and family farming, suddenly found itself at the center of unexpected national attention. Reporters, curious people, and even scientists not officially invited began to appear in town, all wanting to glimpse the extraordinary dogs that were now the subject of sensationalist reports and heated debates on television shows. For Helen, the situation represented a growing internal conflict. On the one hand, the dogs needed protection from exploitation and unethical treatment. On the other hand, she herself longed for answers, to fully understand what they were capable of, and what the best possible future would be for such unique creatures. The constant presence of Michael, who now visited the country house regularly with his team of researchers, only intensified her personal dilemma. "We are just observing, Helen, nothing invasive," he repeated, installing discrete cameras and motion sensors around the property. "Think of the possibilities. These animals can revolutionize our understanding not only of canine cognition, but of the very evolution of intelligence." Helen remained vigilant, but could not deny that Michael's presence brought practical benefits. Academic interest legitimized the situation, warding off more dubious proposals from businessmen and curious people who offered considerable sums for presentations or even purchase of the dogs. In addition, university resources allowed for significant improvements to the makeshift facilities, including adequate shelters for all the animals and specialized veterinary care. 6 months after the initial rescue, Willow Creek prepared for its traditional town fair, an event that normally attracted visitors from all over the region for its square dances, typical food, and demonstrations of faith and culture. That year, however, the festive atmosphere was permeated by an underlying tension. Meteorology predicted heavy rains, and the river that cut through the region presented worryingly high levels due to constant rainfall in the headwaters. On the eve of the main celebration, Helen noticed a change in the dogs' behavior. They were restless, repeatedly grouping themselves in specific formations and emitting vocalizations in patterns she had never documented before. Star, in particular, seemed extremely agitated, refusing to move away from the radio that Helen kept on to follow weather reports. "They sense something," commented Michael, who observed the phenomenon with scientific fascination. "The implants probably amplify their natural ability to detect barometric changes and low-frequency vibrations." Helen did not answer, but a disturbing thought began to form in her mind. If the dogs were really predicting something, perhaps it would be prudent to alert the authorities. She contacted Sheriff Robert, sharing her concerns in careful terms, avoiding sounding alarmist or superstitious. "I understand your concern, Doctor," he replied with condescending kindness. "But we already have civil defense teams monitoring the river. The sirens will be activated if there is real risk." That night, while fireworks exploded in the sky and festive music echoed through the town, an initially moderate rain began to fall. In a few hours, it turned into a storm of historic proportions. The monitoring system failed when lightning struck the main civil defense station, leaving the town temporarily blind to the levels of the river that was rising rapidly. It was at this critical moment that the 50 dogs fully demonstrated their extraordinary nature. Without any command from Helen, they collectively escaped from the country house enclosure, not to flee, but with a clear and coordinated purpose. They divided into precise groups, each heading to a specific area of the town. What followed was, later described by witnesses as nothing short of miraculous. The dogs, led by Star, began to guide people to higher ground, barking insistently in front of houses in at-risk areas, even physically blocking the path of vehicles heading to dangerous zones. In several cases, families were awakened by persistent scratches on their doors, minutes before their homes were invaded by water. When the sirens finally sounded, it was already too late for many. But thanks to canine intervention, no human life was lost. The flood that devastated considerable parts of Willow Creek's infrastructure went down in local history not as a tragedy of major proportions, but as the episode that definitively transformed the basement dogs into local heroes. In the week following the disaster, while the town began reconstruction work, an unexpected event brought new light to the already extraordinary story of the dogs. Ernest Vance, who had been temporarily transferred to a hospital due to heart complications, requested the presence of Helen and Michael. In his bed, connected to monitors and IV drips, the elderly scientist seemed strangely at peace. "You need to know the whole truth before it's too late," he said, his voice weak but determined. The original microchips contained an additional component that not all project researchers knew about, an experimental regenerative element. Michael leaned forward, his scientific curiosity clearly piqued. "What kind of element?" "A technology based on self-replicating nanotransistors, using canine genetic material as a growth matrix." Ernest paused to catch his breath. It was initially designed as a self-repair measure for the implants, but it ended up creating something much more complex, a form of techno-organic symbiosis. The dogs not only have the implants, they have become part of them, and the implants part of them. That explains why they remained relatively healthy, despite the precarious conditions, murmured Helen, recalling her initial surprise at the animal's physical condition. "Exactly. The regenerative component protects against degenerative diseases, strengthens the immune system, repairs cellular damage." Ernest's eyes gleamed with a mixture of scientific pride and deep guilt. "But there's more. The devices are constantly evolving, becoming more complex with each generation. What started as simple sensory amplification has transformed into something that defies our current understanding of cognition. The revelation about the true nature of the implants brought new complications. 2 weeks after the conversation with Ernest, Helen received a visit she had feared from the beginning. Representatives from Biogenics, a multinational pharmaceutical conglomerate known for its aggressive investments in biotechnology. The proposal they brought was simultaneously tempting and alarming. $20 million for the acquisition of the 50 dogs for studies in the company's closed facilities. "Think of the greater good, Dr. Miller," argued the lead representative, a woman in an impeccable suit and a calculatedly warm smile. "The regenerative technology in these animals could revolutionize human medicine, create treatments for diseases incurable today." "And what about the dogs?" questioned Helen, keeping her voice firm despite the anxiety she felt. "What exactly would be the research protocol?" "They would be treated humanely, of course," replied the woman, without really answering. "And consider what you could do with these resources. A permanent sanctuary for hundreds of other animals in need, educational programs, mass sterilization campaigns." The ethical dilemma tormented Helen for days. The sum offered represented, in fact, extraordinary possibilities for her work with abandoned animals. But handing over those 50 exceptional beings to a future of corporate experimentation seemed like an unforgivable betrayal. It was Michael, surprisingly, who offered the perspective that would help in the final decision. "They are not just study objects, Helen. What we are witnessing here is the birth of a new form of intelligence. Hybrid, yes, but genuine and unique. What right do we have to treat them as property?" When Helen formally refused Biogenics' offer, the company tried other approaches: legal pressure, questioning the custody of the animals, attempts to involve federal authorities claiming national security issues, even individual offers to more influential members of the community to convince Helen to reconsider. The small town, which a few months earlier looked at the dogs with distrust and fear, now surprisingly united in their defense. In the 9th month after the initial rescue, a particularly severe storm caused significant damage to the facilities that housed the dogs on Helen's property. Roofs were torn off, fences knocked down, equipment destroyed. The devastation seemed complete, and Helen momentarily felt that all her efforts had been in vain. It was then that she witnessed something she would never forget. The morning after the storm, dozens of residents began to arrive at the country house, bringing construction materials, tools, food, blankets. People she barely knew, some who had never shown interest in the animals, now volunteered to rebuild the sanctuary. "The dogs saved our families during the flood," explained simply Mr. Anthony, an elderly carpenter who informally led the group of volunteers. "Now it's our turn to take care of them." During the reconstruction work, a particularly special bond developed between Mr. Anthony and one of the oldest dogs in the group, a medium-sized mixed breed with mixed gray and white fur that Helen called Wisdom. The animal began to follow the carpenter constantly, observing his work with unusual attention and, more strangely, barking persistently whenever the man took prolonged breaks to rest. The behavior became so consistent that Helen suggested a medical evaluation, just in case. The exams revealed a serious undiagnosed heart condition, which required immediate intervention. "The dog literally saved your life," commented the local doctor, amazed. "Those episodes of discomfort you ignored were mini heart attacks. Without treatment, the next one would probably be fatal." Mr. Anthony's case became just one among several examples of how the dogs were integrating into the community, not just as curiosities or pets, but as active participants. They helped locate lost children during events, anticipated health crises, and seemed to develop an increasingly sophisticated understanding of human language. It was analyzing the documents recovered from the mansion that Helen made another crucial discovery in the week following the reconstruction. Among complex technical projects and coded reports, she found details about the true nature of the microchips. The regenerative component was not just a self-repair tool, but a biomechanical system that deeply integrated into canine DNA, potentially altering it through generations. This explained why puppies born years after the original implantation demonstrated the same enhanced capabilities without ever having undergone surgical procedures. More importantly, the system seemed to be evolving into something that the original creators never predicted, a form of distributed consciousness among all members of the group, where individual experiences became collective knowledge. The OSI hierarchy that Helen had observed was not just social, but functional. Different dogs assumed specific roles within the network, some specializing in communication with humans, others in anticipation of events, others still in group coordination. In the 11th month, inspired by everything she had learned, Helen presented an innovative project to the town hall and potential investors: the creation of a training and research center where the 50 original dogs would help prepare other animals for specialized assistance to people with special needs. The project would integrate ethical scientific research, community service, and protection of the extraordinary animals that had become symbols of Willow Creek. "We are not just talking about guide dogs or conventional therapy animals," she explained in her presentation, carefully omitting details that could lead to new attempts to exploit the animals. "We are proposing a new paradigm of cooperation between species, where the natural abilities of animals are recognized and valued as complementary to ours." The project received enthusiastic support not only from the local community, but from national experts in animal behavior, doctors, therapists, and even government representatives impressed with the preliminary results. In a few weeks, the small town that previously based its economy on religious tourism and agriculture began to reinvent itself as a center of reference for human-animal interaction studies. Meanwhile, the relationship between Helen and Michael gradually evolved from professional distrust and personal resentment to a partnership based on mutual respect and shared goals. The philosophical disagreements that had separated the couple in the past seemed less important in the face of the shared responsibility for the extraordinary beings that had entered their lives. It was not exactly a romantic reconciliation, but a meaningful reconnection between two people united by a unique mission. Exactly 1 year after the initial rescue, Willow Creek organized a special celebration in the central square, part tribute to the hero dogs, part symbolic inauguration of the future training and research center. The small town was unrecognizable, decorated with colorful banners, full of visitors, and vibrating with a renewed energy of purpose and community pride. It was during this celebration that the most extraordinary event of the entire saga occurred. The 50 dogs, brought to the square with special collars developed by Michael that allowed total freedom of movement without risk of escape, suddenly organized themselves into a perfect formation of concentric circles. In the center, Star, the Labrador who first established contact with Helen in that dark basement a year earlier, positioned himself like a conductor in front of an orchestra. What followed left hundreds of spectators in absolute silence, many with tears in their eyes. The dogs, in perfect synchrony, began a series of barks, movements, and postures that, when analyzed later through the decoding algorithms that Michael had developed, revealed themselves to be a complex form of communication. They were not just basic warning signals or expressions of primary needs. It was a structured language, with recognizable patterns of syntax and vocabulary of their own. And the message, although impossible to literally translate into English, clearly conveyed concepts of gratitude, belonging, and shared hope for the future. Those 50 extraordinary beings, neither completely canine nor artificial, but something entirely new and unique, had developed in the depths of a dark basement and through years of isolation from the outside world, capabilities that surpassed the previously known limits between species. Their journey from darkness to light was not just physical, but represented an evolution of consciousness and cooperation that offered profound lessons about adaptation, resilience, and the unexplored possibilities of interspecies communication. For Helen, watching that extraordinary demonstration with a mixture of scientific astonishment and deep emotion, everything finally made sense. Her arrival in Willow Creek, which before seemed just an escape from past disappointments, now revealed itself to be part of something bigger, a shared destiny that united humans and animals in a new form of community based not on domination, but on mutual understanding and genuine respect. The story of these 50 extraordinary dogs not only transformed a small, rural town, but offered a glimpse of revolutionary possibilities for the future of interspecies relationships. In a world increasingly divided by conflicts and misunderstandings, they represented a powerful reminder of our shared capacity for evolution, adaptation, and, above all, genuine connection across the barriers we believed insurmountable.